So for this one, we're going over Chapter 5, Kyushu 1. We're going to start looking at languages here in Chapter 5. Specifically, we need to know a generalization of where languages are distributed throughout the world. So what language, and then where is it kind of around the world. First thing, language, again, is a communication or a system of communication that has speech or a collection of sounds that a general group of people understand, and they have share the same exact meaning for all the sounds and words in that language. So one of these questions that was really hard to answer in class and kind of go over is how many languages are there in the world? Depending on who you ask, this changes, but you have roughly 7,100 different languages in the world. So of those 7,100 different languages that we have, only 11 are spoken by 100 million people. Essentially, most of the other languages in the world are spoken by a lot smaller amount of people in the world. Usually they're isolated and pocketed around the world. So these are the 11 that we need to know, and kind of geographically speaking where they are in the world where they are being spoken. Some languages do have a literary tradition, which is a system of communication. Not all languages have this literary tradition, but for the most part, most of them do. Again, this is just the writing down of the language. So the language has a sound that means something. Now you have to actually write down that sound. Again, not all languages have this kind of literary tradition going throughout the world. Most countries in the world have a designated official language. The United States does not have an official language. This is when you have an official language, it's for government business, anything public that they need to get out the same message to everybody in the country. Some different places have multiple official languages, so that means all those documents that they print, all the laws have to be in all those different languages. By default, the United States uses English, okay, but we also have other language that things are printed at, but it's not an official language, okay? Not everything has to be printed that way, but for our culture, for what most people communicate, it is pretty prevalent here. Again, road signs in Jerusalem, okay, you got many different kind of official languages here, showing Jerusalem, different language, but they all say the same thing. Prominent places in the world that are having a struggle with an official language is India. As you can see, all these different pockets of cultures, of different groups here that speak all these different languages. It's hard to have an official language for an entire country when you have all these different languages being spoken throughout the country. So if you're kind of thinking of like centrifugal forces, if you will, language in India would be definitely a centrifugal force, as you have over 400 different languages there for that. For the most part, Hindi and English are kind of the two official languages of India, but you have like 20 others that are going to be kind of scheduled languages. Basically, this means they, in certain regions, they're official languages. So not everywhere. So like the region of the Northeast United States, they would have like a scheduled language. But here we do not. But in India, it's one way they can kind of govern these smaller areas, let them kind of have an official language for the area. But as the entire country, they do not have an official language. The idea of what's the official language of the world, for the United Nations, it recognizes 6 different languages. So everything they have, if you go to their website, they are printed in these 6 different languages that they consider to be official. So all the communications the United Nations does are with these 6 languages. So now looking at the classification of the languages, where and how kind of are they organized? The first thing they're organized is the language families. These are the really big, broad ones we were kind of looking at before. The trunks of the trees, if you will, before they start breaking off. So you have language families. You're going to have very few of these. However, you are now going to have branches within every family. Okay, so you're going to have more branches because you have more families. So if this language family has one kind of tree trunk, all right, but it has 5 branches, the next one might have one tree trunk, but then they might have 3 branches. So the further away they get from the family, the less and less the languages are going to be related. Then when you break off into a branch, okay, now you're going to start having these groups. These groups are the languages that are going to be very, very similar to each other. Okay, so you can have multiple languages in the same language family. They sound kind of nothing alike, but at the deep root of it, they do have similarities. However, if you have the same grammar, same pronunciation for a couple words, same meanings, that sounds very similar, Okay, these are going to be language groups. So for an example here, we are going to have the Indo-European language family. Okay, now we're going to have a big branch here. We're going to start looking at kind of the Romance branch, one we looked at before. And then kind of in the groups here, you're now going to have Spanish, Portuguese, which are very similar. Also a little more similar to Italian, but not exactly. Okay, Sicilian and Italian, different languages, but they're going to be in the same language, or the same group here, language group, because they sound very, very similar. Okay, so the further away you get from the trunk of the tree, the language family, okay, the more they are not going to sound the same. So Hindi and Italian probably to us do not sound the same, but they can be traced back to the same language family. Linguists kind of believe that there's many languages now have emerged from a few ancient languages. Again, this is kind of a hypothesis. We can't truly prove this. So this is all before recorded history that a language started to occur, started to develop. So we do not have written records kind of prove this. However, this is kind of an example. You have seen this in your textbook. So we have our language families here, but below here they believe these are kind of the original languages that the language families kind of emerged from. Again, this is just a hypothesis. It's just a model. Now looking at kind of the major world language families, these are ones we should know, kind of where they're placed. Keep in mind, 2/3 of the world's population speak out of 2 of the major language families. You have Indo-European and then Sino-Tibetan, which make up a majority of the world. So 2/3 of the world speak these 2 kind of language families. Not languages, but language families. Still by far, the biggest is going to be Indo-European. Usually you have kind of the European languages, and then you have India here, so thus it's going to make up a large amount of the world. Again, so the first one here, Indo-European, predominant language, so think of European culture, influence, okay, colonization to North America, colonization to South America, colonization to, okay, Australia. So that's going to be the European end, and then also remember the Indo part of it. It's not all of India, but kind of on the way to India is kind of the way to think about it. So think about Indo-European, kind of on the way to India, and then anywhere else kind of the Europeans have gone is going to be the prominent language. The second most spoken language in the world, or language family I should say, is the Sino-Tibetan. So think about kind of where Tibet is. You're going to think more China, the China region over here, Southeast Asia. This is going to be very, very prominent in this area. Again, one reason you have a lot of people speaking is because of the large population in Southeast Asia, specifically China. Mandarin is the most widely used language in the world. Okay, so the specific language of Mandarin is the biggest language in the world. Again, spoken by most of the Chinese people and more than 900 million people around the world. They use logograms. For their literary tradition, they do not have words. They do not have broken down alphabet here. These symbols all mean something else. So this would mean river. Okay. And then this is obviously bed, so you put them together and you have river bed. They're not phonetic, which simply means you cannot sound these symbols out. You literally have to memorize them. You may not have riptide memorized, but you could probably sound riptide out just by knowing, okay, these letters. So our alphabet, we don't have many letters, therefore we can start pronouncing our words. In Mandarin, okay, you're going to start having these languages that these symbols mean something, so you have to memorize all these different logograms throughout. Many of these systems use roots, which simply means, okay, they're going to be very similar to each other. The symbol helps categorize it, recognize it a little bit. They're very similar from one to another. Part of the pride of China, and one of the kind of the centripetal forces there, is how few languages are actually spoken. So India, you have a lot of different languages, which breaks it up. India, on the other hand, China, on the other hand, has very few languages. So that's kind of a sense of national pride and unity, which kind of brings them together, and it helps them kind of, build unity to kind of compete in the world. So now kind of moving on to these other world language families, just an idea. So we have English, Mandarin here, you're going to have Korean over here, part of this language kind of family. So other than Sino-Tibetan, keep in mind many of the island nations in Southeast Asia do speak their own languages, but they are also spoken, okay, by very few amount of people, mainly because of isolation. So keep in mind, one of the main reasons you might have a language that is preserved, has never changed much, is because of isolation. So if they do never leave the island, they don't need to really speak a different language. They do not need to change that in order to communicate with other people. So keep that in mind kind of moving forward, that isolation is a major cause of a lot of small languages, and also isolation is a reason that a language may not change very often. So now we're going to look at Javanese. This should not kind of be confused with Japanese. Javanese is going to be the biggest language in the Austronesian language family. So this language family, if you look at Austria, think of where Austria, you have either Austria, Australia. So think more in Australia kind of area, even though Australia doesn't speak it. Micronesia, kind of the part that this kind of comes in. Think about the island nations over here. Obviously, the major outlier here is going to be Madagascar. This you can kind of think about and analyze that it's probably came through relocation diffusion. So if you're ever looking for an example of relocation diffusion for languages, that would be a really good one. But over here you have Indonesia, which you're going to have many other different languages in that country. So Indonesia has hundreds of languages because of the isolation of many of its different islands. The main island of Java, the main population center, is going to have one, but then you're going to have all these other different islands out here that are going to have many different languages spoken because they are not very cohesive. So when you kind of talk about a fragmented state, if you will, that's part of the problem for Indonesia is the different languages that they carry out through the country. Next one here, we're going to look at Austroasiatic. So again, kind of think Austro somewhere, okay, over in this region, but you have Asiatic, so it's not going to be Micronesia, it's going to be on Asia here. So Vietnamese is the major one for this, predominantly Vietnam here, where 80 million people in the world speak that language. Next up being Thai. Thai is going to be the largest language in the Tay Kadai language family, so think about maybe where Thailand is. If you know, can kind of connect these two together, it's going to make it a little bit easier for you to kind of remember where that is. So quick review here, we have Indo-European, so it's going to be a little more India, Europe, European colonized places, okay. Then we had Sino-Tibetan, okay. The Chinese, okay, Tibet area is going to be predominant. Now we're looking at Thai, so think about where Thailand is, and that should help you out a little bit. One for us to identify is going to be the Japonic language family. Japanese is going to be the main one there. Almost all people who speak Japanese all live in Japan, so it's not going to be dispersed much throughout the world. And again, Japanese writing uses a phonetic symbol system, kind of with two tiers here, so it's not going to be exactly like Japanese, but their system of writing and phonetic symbols are going to be a little bit different. So keep that in mind. Japanese characters are not logograms, but Chinese logograms may sometimes be used. So sometimes they might borrow something from China or from Chinese to kind of use it. However, for the most part, Japanese characters are not just symbols. Okay, these symbols actually have a phonetic meaning. So a certain symbol means a certain pronunciation. With the geographic theme of where they are located by kind of how the language family is named, the Koreanic. So think about Korean, mainly going to be North and South Korea, sometimes also simply just referred to as Korea. So Korean writing, on the other hand, is also phonetic, which simply means, again, that every shape, symbol has a sound to it. Again, different from Mandarin and Chinese, but also very similar to Japanese. And many new words are used in Korean that they kind of steal or borrow from Japanese and Mandarin. Biggest one here is going to be Dravidian world language, kind of for the family. Tamil is going to be the biggest one by far in this language family. It's the only kind of real large one in this family, and is spoken on the island of Sri Lanka, and then also part of the India peninsula here that is closer to Sri Lanka. So if you can associate this with Sri Lanka, it can kind of help you out kind of a little bit. Usually Indian speakers kind of resist the dominance of Northern Hindu, so this is going to be more towards the coastal region Tamil is spoken. So this category is kind of controversial a little bit. Alteatic is going to be spread out between Turkey and kind of the in-between between Russia, northern of the Himalaya areas, and then you have part of Siberia. So this one will be a little bit harder for us to kind of recognize where it is, because the obvious outlier is going to be Turkey. But once you know it's Turkey, you also know that Turkish is going to be the biggest language for that language family. Altic languages have become an official language of several, again, post-Soviet countries. So when the Soviet Union broke down, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan are all these different places that now have official languages that are a part of this. So under the USSR, they had to be forced to speak Russian. So Russian was going to be tried to the force centrifugal force there. However, you could also say it's a centrifugal force because all these different places did not want to speak Russian at that time. So Turkish is kind of interesting in the fact that at one point it was written in Arabic, so they used Arabic characters to phonetically kind of write out the Turkish language. But then Turkey's more modern leader has kind of switched that into Latin characters. So all these characters are very familiar to us because we use those in our language. If it was written in Arabic, the meaning would be the same, okay, but we would not be able to kind of even understand the letters that are in it. Hungarian, so keep in mind, Austro-Hungarian Empire, so you have Hungary here, which obviously Uralic is going to be the major language family here. Hungarian is going to be the major one in there. So keep in mind, Hungary is an outlier, so you need to start thinking about where is an outlier for. Kind of hard to try to remember this, but know that it's northern, okay? So know that Uralic is going to be spoken in Hungary and then in the kind of northern part of Europe. So now we're going into a little more complicated one with the African language families. So again, keep in mind Africa has many different nations in there, not states, nations, if you will. So in every one of these nations, okay, you have also different ethnicities. They're all going to have their own language. So you have roughly 1,000 different distinct languages in Africa on its own. However, most lack a written tradition. It's kind of one of the reasons it's a little bit harder to kind of differentiate one language from another. So if you think about Afro-Asiatic, so think about this has to connect Africa and Asia. Where would Africa and Asia connect? Okay, the Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula here in northern Africa. These are going to be more predominant Islamic countries because many of them do use Arabic as their language. So keep that in mind. Afro-Asiatic, think about kind of Middle East here a little bit, northern Africa. Okay, so what language or what religion are they? Okay, they're Islam, so they use Arabic. So yeah, Arabic's probably spoken a lot in this area. That's kind of the process you want to think about where that's spoken. Arabic is an official language in 24 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, but not all of them. As you can see kind of previously here, not all Middle Eastern countries fall under this category. Again, it's also spoken as a second language by 300 million Muslims, so people that live in all these other Middle Eastern countries, more than likely their second language is going to be Arabic because they need to use that for their religion day to day, because it is the language of the Quran. Using that geographic identifier to help us kind of figure out where they are. So you have the Niger-Congo language family. So if you know Afro-Asiatic is in northern, think about where Niger and Congo is. Okay, know that it's that kind of region in Africa. Also kind of moving out to the western kind of peninsula in Africa here, more closer to the United States. Swahili is by far going to be the biggest one in the Nigeria-Congo region. The first language of only 800,000 people, however. Official language of Tanzania, but it's also spoken by 30 million Africans as a secondary language. Okay, so that kind of shows us if it's also spoken as a secondary language, it's going to be a little more of a lingua franca in that region, because many other people use that from one to another, especially people from the outside use it to communicate with the many different villages. So the Nilo-Saharan, I would kind of think of kind of the Nile River Valley. I know you guys kind of only associated with Egypt. So think about where Sahara Desert is, okay, Nilo meaning Nile, okay, kind of think of that region. The most common language here is going to be Luo of Kenya. It's going to be the widest spoken language in this area. Keep in mind it only has a little over 4 million speakers, so it's not that big. Final language family is going to be Cohesian. Namba is going to be the largest language in this family, spoken roughly by over 200,000 people in southwestern Africa. This is going to be a little harder for us to identify, so if you can kind of remember the different ones that we did, and you're going to your last one here, so you have Afroasiatic. Okay, you have the Nilo-Sahara, kind of in this area here, and then you have the Niger-Congo. Okay, and now you're kind of missing one spot. Well, which part of Africa did we not really hit? Okay, that's where you can kind of fill in cohesion right here to kind of fill that gap for you. This one is distinct, so the one you probably have a hard time remembering where it is the one that have those distinct clicking sounds. So in their language, you definitely hear that distinct clicking. That is one kind of identifier or separation between them, that language, from all the other languages in Africa. Quick review of Africa. Okay, we have Afroasiatic. Arabic's going to be the biggest one here. Okay, the green area, you have Niger and Congo. Think about where Niger and Congo would be. Okay, and now we're moving to the Nilo-Saharan. Okay, you got the Nile kind of river valley starting here. You got the Sahara Desert. Okay, then you have cohesion. Now you got to start thinking about that part. Okay, where is that part? We haven't done southern part of Africa. Keep in mind, Afrikaans in English, okay, are going to be more Indo-European, mainly because that was colonized heavily by the UK. So Africa is also a really good example then of highly lingual diversity throughout the world, especially for languages, and a result of that is the many different ethnicities and nations that lie within Africa.